Okay, welcome to our program today, Health Impacts from Heat, What to Know and What You Can Do. I'm Laurel Plimier. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont in California, and I want to thank everyone who's joining us today for taking time out of your day to spend with us on Zoom and on YouTube. Today's event is the fourth in a larger 2022-2023 climate speaker series, and it's brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Piedmont and Piedmont Connect. Today's event is also co-sponsored by the Leagues of Women Voters of Solano County in California and Portland, Oregon. We have members from at least 9 different local leagues representing California, Oregon, and Colorado joining us today. So our previous 3 programs in this series covered the topics of wildfires, textiles, and groundwater management. And you can find recordings of those programs on our YouTube channel under the Live tab. And we have 3 additional programs coming up this year, 2 additional programs. Today's program is the 3rd. 2 additional programs coming up this year. One is on electric vehicle policy and regulation, and that'll be on March 1st. And then on April 5th, we have a program on renewable energy and storage that will close out the series. As we solidify the details of those events, you'll see them show up on our calendar on our website, which you can find at lwvpiedmont.org. And we hope you'll join us for those events too. So before we get to the introduction of today's guest speaker, I just wanted to quickly go over a few logistics. If you are here on the Zoom call with us, you can post your questions for the speaker either now or anytime during the presentation using the Q&A feature. And you can also introduce yourself in chat to say hello and let us know where you're coming from. But we're more likely to see your questions if you post them in the Q&A. If you're watching live on YouTube, you can also post questions in the live chat there. And if you are joining us on YouTube or watching the recording of this program on YouTube later, please subscribe to our channel. And if you click the bell, you'll get notifications of our future live stream events. And for advance notice of upcoming events, please join our mailing list, which you can do on our website. And again, that's lwvpiedmont.org. And you can also become a member of the League there. As is typical of our events today, about 1/3 of the people who registered for this event are not yet members of the League, so we'd love to have you join us. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We encourage informed and active participation in government, work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influence public policy through education and advocacy. And when we say nonpartisan, what we mean is that we do not support or oppose any political candidate or political party, but we are political. We're not neutral on policy. And when you join the League, your dues alone support our grassroots efforts, both locally and at the state and national levels. And this helps us in our mission of empowering voters and defending democracy. You can find a local league by going to lwv.org if you're not in the local Piedmont area. If you are in Piedmont, you can join our Piedmont League at lwvpiedmont.org. The League's efforts in voter education and advocacy are extremely important work, and we greatly appreciate your support. So to introduce our guest speaker, I'm now going to hand things over to Hope Salzer, who is on the board of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont. She's our current climate advocacy director. She's also a former president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and she helped put together this climate series with Jennifer Trainer and volunteers from Piedmont Connect, which is our local climate advocacy organization. So Hope.
Thank you very much, Laurel. First of all, I guess I just wanted to quickly say that I do encourage everyone on the call to become a member of the League. I was always an active voter, but I feel that since I joined the League, I became a much more informed and enthusiastic voter, and also a stronger advocate, because I'm just more knowledgeable about the issues in our around us, all around us in our society. So anyway, I am very, very pleased today to introduce Dr. Rupa Basu, who is currently the Chief of Air and Climate Epidemiology Section at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or the OEHHA of the California Environmental Protection Agency. Prior to becoming the chief, she worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and holds a PhD in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins and an MPH from UCLA. She serves on several national and state climate change committees and is a frequent guest speaker, as taught in academic settings, and also speaks for as an expert on this topic for high-level government leadership. And on top of all of that, I got to know Rupa as a mom. Our oldest sons are the same age, and I always admired her ability to, her grace under pressure with two very kinesthetically active boys next to my one bookish boy. So thank you, Rupa, for being here and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Yeah, of course. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for that introduction, Hope and Laurel. I really appreciate it. And I, right before this, we talked about how I've never given a presentation to the Piedmont community about my work before. So it's really my pleasure to be here today. I'm going to start with trying to share my screen. Hopefully this will work again. Okay, here we go. You can see that okay? Okay, so the title of my talk today is Health Impacts from Extreme Heat. I have extreme in quotes because, so I see this term thrown around a lot, and every time I see extreme heat, I cringe a little bit. And that's only because we don't need to see extreme heat to see health effects. We are already seeing climate change related heat and health effects. So that is just with the background temperatures that we experience during the warm season, May through September. Of course, if there's an extreme heat event, such as a heat wave, those health effects might get worse, but we're already seeing these effects. And you can see here that I have two photos here. I often get asked how I got interested in this topic. And I'm originally from India, and I used to visit India several times throughout my childhood. And you can see here the picture on the left. It's so hot there sometimes that the ground actually melts. And then on the right-hand side, you could see that the air pollution is so thick that sometimes they have to close airports. For me personally, I have developed asthma going to India, where I don't normally have any respiratory effects. So this is how I got interested in the topic. So I'm going to start with a little picture of my family. So my husband, Michael Silverberg, and I, and then my son, Ravi, who's a 10th grader at Piedmont High School and plays on the varsity basketball team. And then my son, Arjun Silverberg, who graduated last year and is now a freshman at UCLA. And this is a nice picture of our vacation. Since I couldn't include our dog, he doesn't get to come on our international trips. We also have a dog named Rocco. So there he is. Okay, so back to the talk. So you've all probably seen these headlines. They're pretty alarming about heat waves. They've hit globally. So there's, I just have a few captions here: Oregon, India, Australia, Russia, Victoria. And of course, probably the most alarming has been the 2003 European heat wave, where there were 70,000 excess deaths. So this is just a very quick graphic just to show the relationship between global temperature and CO2 concentration over the last century, or a little bit more than the last century. And you can see there's a pretty direct relationship. So for anyone who doubts that temperature is going up because of greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide. There's a lot of data. I just used a simple graph to show that there's a very high correlation. And most of this is man-made, because you could see at the turn of like the Industrial Revolution, that's when we're really seeing the CO2 concentrations pick up pretty exponentially. And I just want to say that we can't, of course, regulate temperature, but if we know what's driving this temperature increase, if it's greenhouse gas emissions such as CO2, we can try to regulate those. So there's a lot going on in this graphic, but really the point that I want to make here is that there's this report that this is included in. It's a climate change vulnerability index. There's a term that we use a lot. It's called the climate gap. You can see that the poorest countries are most affected by climate change, but they're not the biggest carbon emitters. The biggest carbon emitters are actually China, the US, India, Japan, and Russia. And, you know, I guess India is the only one that you could see is also very highly impacted by climate. But if we take this back to the national scale, same thing there. If we take this to just California, which I study a lot because I'm a state worker, same thing there. And then if we go to regions within California or local communities, same thing there. It's the poor who are most impacted. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about heat, air pollution, COVID, infectious diseases, anything else, it's always the poor who are most impacted. And I'll get into that a little bit more in some of my future slides. So currently, the Centers for Disease Control reports about 700 deaths annually from heat-related illness. And, you know, if you look at this graph, I'm not really so interested in looking at the comparison between males and females. It just happened to be in this graphic, but that's pretty similar anyway. But you could see that some years we have some pretty large increases. For example, in 1994 to 1995, that's from this Chicago heat wave. We had a big heat wave in 2010 on the East Coast. But even though heat is the biggest killer among climate change exposures, there is a very severe underreporting of heat-related illnesses. So I'm just going to spend the next couple of slides talking about that a little bit more. I just told you this. So why are they so underreported? Well, there's no systematic definition for heat wave in the US. So when you're thinking about policies and, you know, when one local health department might use one definition for heat wave and another neighboring health department might use another one, and then, you know, it's like there's really no consistency. And then vulnerable subgroups, we need to include them in heat advisories. How are we going to prevent, you know, these health effects? It's if we can include the vulnerable populations in heat advisories. Well, they vary by location, so that's also really important. But if you don't have a systematic definition for heat wave, it's really hard to really highlight those vulnerable subgroups. So an example of a definition that we could use for a heat wave, in case you're wondering, is in some of our studies, we use 98th percentile of temperature distribution. So you use a distribution in a specific area for 2 or more days. And this could be daytime or nighttime. Sometimes we've seen that it's actually the nighttime temperatures that are, you know, have stronger associations. And sometimes it could be a daytime temperature or both. So we need thresholds for both. The other issue is that heat-related deaths or illnesses are only reported during a heat wave. So that's what in epidemiology we call that a surveillance bias, or when no other cause of death is suspected. So you can imagine that if there's somebody who dies from a heart attack and it's also hot outside, they're not going to be captured in this population. But if somebody is found in an apartment living by themselves, oh, and there was a heat wave 3 or 4 days ago, and we're now finding this body, we'll say that was a heat-related death. And so I didn't mean to be so morbid, but that's really what happens. It's just so hard to define a heat-related death. So it's not just from the exposure to the heat wave, but it's also the outcome. So there's a lot on this slide too, but if there's one message that I want to convey here, this is it. It's very important to consider health effects other than mortality, and also health effects from specific diseases. So in our work, what we really focus on is increases in temperature, or sometimes we might look at a heat wave, and the risk of emergency room visits, hospital admissions, and mortality. And mortality is still important to look at it, but doesn't give the whole picture. So some of the outcomes that we'll look at, just to give an example, is, of course, the classic heat-related deaths and illnesses, as well as dehydration, cardiovascular diseases, such as heart attacks, as I said before, respiratory diseases, such as asthma, which is also tied to some of the air pollution work that we do, diabetes, mental health, liver and kidney diseases, infectious diseases, gastrointestinal diseases, adverse birth outcomes, such as preterm delivery, low birth weight, and stillbirth. So really, when I first started this work, we had only looked at cardiovascular and respiratory deaths and illnesses in people over 65. In the last 20 years, we've found that there are many high-risk groups, and the more we study and the more we know, we find that there's more organs that are affected, more populations at risk. You might be wondering why I have a couple of these in red. So mental health and preterm delivery. These are areas that I've put a little bit more emphasis on my own research in the past few years. Mental health, because I don't think, whether it's climate change related or any other kind of mental health, I think it's just so understudied. I saw some articles talking about how violence increases during high heat events. And I thought, well, we have this data. Let's look at temperature and mental health outcomes. And of course, found this pretty strong association, whether it was suicides or homicides or other outcomes. So that study was only published 5 years ago. But since then, I've seen studies all throughout the world kind of replicating our results. Same thing with this preterm delivery. The study that we published was back in 2010, the first study. I've published a lot since then, just kind of trying to expand this area of research. Again, I think women and children are often the last to get studied. So I wanted to really focus on this. And since then, there's been a lot more work done in that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those studies later in this presentation. Okay, so this is mechanisms for people who are interested, more than you probably ever would want to know about mechanisms. So that's my colleague actually created this for a book chapter that we're co-authoring. And if you just look at I guess the colored, just heat stress can affect heat rash or lead to heat rash caused by dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, heat exhaustion, heat injury, heat stroke, heat collapse, and eventually multi-organ system failure and death. There's so many different pathways that this could happen, and different processes in our thermoregulatory, that's our ability to control our own body temperature, that doesn't work properly to cause these health effects. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about California now. In 2018, we published a fourth climate change assessment. The same report was published by the US EPA at about the same time. We plan to do these every 5 years. And we're actually a little bit behind because I know that a bunch of state agencies are meeting now to release the next one in 2025. But what I want to highlight is one of the figures kind of told us about what do we need to worry about in California? Well, there's temperature, sea level rise, snowpack, and I know we're all seeing this. Heavy precipitation events. I think we've experienced that just the most recently. Drought, and in some places, this heavy rain has actually helped the drought, at least temporarily, and wildfires. So I'll often get asked about these other exposures. I do not know too much about them. I really focus on temperature and heat, and more recently, wildfire smoke exposure as it relates to air pollution. Okay, so I borrowed this graphic from the California Nevada Applications Program, or CNAP. We collaborate with a lot of outside agencies, or we would not be able to do all this work. One of them is the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and so they gave me this slide. What it really says is that if you look at daytime and nighttime temperatures, daytime temperatures are depicted in red here, and then blue is nighttime temperatures. And you can see on the y-axis, we have just degree days and year. So look at the change over time. Just if you just sit back and look at it, you could see that there was more red prior to 1980. Now, more recently, we have more blue. So what that tells us is we really need to worry about nighttime temperature. As I said, I think at the beginning of my presentation, it doesn't give our body's ability to cool down at night. So if we have like a really hot day, but then at night, you know, we, as happened in the past, then that would give our body some relief, and we don't have that ability anymore because the temperatures are so high at night. Another thing is that heat wave index. And so sometimes the index also includes humidity. The humidity has also increased. So in California, we haven't generally had very humid heat waves, but more recently, the trend has been more hot and humid heat waves. This is another slide from CNAP. You can see on the left is what we're predicting, or what we're already seeing a little bit of, and predicting in the near future. The graphic on the right is showing us what we'll see more at the turn of the century. So it's the blue to the red or maroon brown just shows us that there's you know, some places might, not in California, but might be getting cooler over time, and then most places will be getting a lot hotter because they're red or brown. Well, what kind of jumps out right away is you see that the coastal areas in California are going to be the most impacted. This is an important concept. What happens in coastal area is, well, we know in Northern California, not all of us have air conditioners, so that's part of the problem. But a bigger part of the problem is that it's very heavily populated, but we're not acclimated to heat. So just to give an example, an average temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit in San Francisco could constitute a heat wave, whereas in Sacramento, we would need a temperature over 100 degrees to constitute a heat wave, right? So it's just what we're used to. And then there's also, like, when I showed the biological mechanisms, those also vary by what temperature you have experienced most recently. So that also goes with biological adaptation. Okay, so you can see here, I have some more future trends in California. You can see this nice map, and what we're experiencing now is pretty mild temperatures. And actually, I have to say that when I started doing heat work in California, a lot of people would ask me, why are you doing this work here? Our temperatures are so mild. Well, because they're so mild, we're not used to the heat waves. And so it really does impact us a lot. And we have a lot more diversity in terms of temperatures and climate and population than I think a lot of people are aware of. So at the turn of the century, just to quantify how much hotter we're expecting to see, it's about 4 to 5 degrees on average hotter in California. So on average means that some days might be twice that much, some days might be cooler, some days, you know, we just get the average. So it's important to think about if we had, you know, 10, 15 degree warmer temperatures and how we could acclimate to that. I mentioned that heat wave in 2003 in Europe resulted in so many deaths, and that was a lot of people over 65 in urban areas. By mid-century, we're seeing that we're going to have more heat-related deaths and also illnesses in urban areas. And also, the population over 65 is not only increasing, but the mortality will be increasing tenfold by the 2090s. So what are some of the populations at risk? I just wanted to show you. People over 65, socially isolated populations, pregnant women, young children, outdoor workers, certain medications or mental illnesses, living on higher floors in apartment buildings, sometimes also not air conditioned. Poverty, which is measured in so many different ways. And young athletes. So if you look at each of these high-risk populations, they each have very unique issues related to them. So for example, the heat advisories currently don't include pregnant women. So if people don't know that they're at high risk, or their caretakers or their families don't know that they're at high risk, there won't be any precautions taken. They'll just say, oh, that's for other people, not us. So it's really important to kind of think of this. For young athletes, I haven't seen too much about canceling sports when it's 110 degrees outside, or just sending children, for example, out to play on the blacktop when it's really hot outside. But then, maybe the alternative is to be inside where there's no air conditioning and there's just fans blowing hot air. So we're trying to develop guidelines around this, heat and also for wildfire smoke. Right now, we're really kind of, I don't want to say behind, but we're behind. We have not developed guidelines. Recently, I have seen some things pop up for athletic events, but that's only in the last year. And it's really kind of arbitrary who gets what information. So we really need to, in terms of getting this out to the public, we've got a lot of work to do there. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to go over very briefly a couple of studies. They're epidemiologic studies. I mentioned the risk of high ambient temperature, so not extreme heat, but high ambient temperature, and risk of preterm delivery. So there's about a 9% increase in preterm delivery for all pregnant people. But I do want to highlight, oops, sorry, I went too fast, that there is a difference by race or ethnic group. And this is important for environmental justice issues, because overall there's a 9% increase. And this is largely driven, this is how we have race ethnicity on the x-axis. This is how it's coded. I don't really agree with this coding, but this is how it's in our health data. There's Black, Hispanic, white, and Asian. We created that. It's a pretty diverse group, but we created that on our own. And then you can see on the y-axis, percent change per 10 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature. I don't want to focus so much on the actual numbers, but more on the trend. What are we seeing? We're seeing that compared to the overall population, Black people have higher risk for preterm delivery associated with heat. Same thing with Hispanics, same thing with white, same thing with Asian. So that means everybody, all pregnant people are at high risk, but we can't, if you look at Black versus white, the risk is almost, not quite, 2.5 times greater for Black people versus white. Hispanics also have a slightly greater risk, and so do Asians. If we look at age, we're seeing what we call a nice dose response association. So younger mothers, there are all on the left-hand side, have higher risk for this study specifically. I don't mean this is for everything heat related, than older mothers. And this is also important. So the reason I'm talking about these high-risk populations and kind of giving this example for a specific study is it's really important to highlight the high-risk populations, because so much of this is preventable. So if we have this information, so I just had to say that after doing that first study, the reason that I got that hypothesis even is from my own pregnancies. So as I was pregnant, I'm one of those people who always runs really cold. Okay. The people laugh at me. I've got like the vest and the down comforter and it's 60 degrees outside. But during my pregnancies, I would just like heat up when everybody else was like, no, I'm comfortable. It's fine. And I realized that that's the same thing that I've been reading about the thermoregulatory process in the elderly or in infants. And I said, well, maybe pregnant women are also at high risk. And I feel like so much of the ideas that we get as researchers comes from our own personal lives. And this is why I think, I have to say we need more women and girls in science, because how else would you get this hypothesis, right? So yeah, from that first study, there's a lot of skepticism. There was this, oh, well, that's just one study. That's, ridiculous. Even though I found a lot of biological mechanisms, which I'll show you, that kind of proves this point. So 10 years later, once there's like so much research done on this topic, I was proud to be part of this systematic review where we talked about heat, air pollution, primarily particulate matter and ozone, and all of these health outcomes or adverse birth outcomes that I've studied. So preterm birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth, we found that there were 68 studies and 32 million births between 2007 and the middle of 2019. And actually, they had so much of the same results in terms of not just, yes, there's this association, but the high-risk populations are still, again, Black mothers from heat, and we saw Latina or Hispanic mothers for air pollution. So there's still this disparity, and we found so much consistency. So I'm just going to go over the mechanism just because I think it's important to look for some of these signs. These can be signs of dehydration that are not just what you see for pregnant women: headache, nausea, vomiting. And you can look at this list. A lot of these are just symptoms that many of us have experienced with pregnancy, but that's why I think it's hard to connect this to the heat, that people say, oh, it's just part of the pregnancy. This is normal. Don't worry about it. But if someone is pregnant and they're experiencing the symptoms, to kind of think about, okay, well, maybe this is something more serious. I don't want some of these, adverse birth outcomes like preterm delivery to happen to me or to my friend or, whoever. So these dehydration symptoms lead to oxidative stress and inflammation, which releases oxytocin in the body. And if anybody had labor induced, it's the same thing as Pitocin. Pitocin pretty much mimics natural oxytocin in the body, which decreases uterine blood flow. When you decrease uterine blood flow, we know that the fetus can't get the nutrients that it needs. That leads to decreased fetal growth and ultimately induces labor. Okay, so I just want to talk about some of the reasons for the disparities. Okay, so first, there's differential exposure. I got asked recently, so now you're telling me that we're breathing different air than other communities in California. And I said, yes, actually, that is kind of true. So what I mean by that is I think we've seen the billboards on Grand or Broadway where it says life expectancy varies by zip code. Well, air pollution exposure could also vary, maybe not by zip code, but by neighboring communities. And why is that? Well, there's greater exposures to heat and air pollution. This is also known as environmental racism or justice. It's because certain communities live closer to power plants, fossil fuel combustion areas, freeways, and that if you're in more urban areas too, there's the urban heat island. The cements and the blacktops traps the heat and actually retains it. So green space, there's been a lot of studies to show that does actually decrease health effects. And this is all a result, or I don't say all, mostly a result of historical redlining and where people live. Now, again, I went with the exposure and as epidemiologists, then we looked at the health outcomes. Why is there this disparity here? Well, some of it does come from lower socioeconomic status. There's a high cost of air conditioning, and so some people may not be able to afford using the air conditioning, or if they even have one. If there's like I don't know, a wildfire event, relocation may not be feasible for everybody. People may also have to work regardless of, whether they're an outdoor worker or working at a hospital. They may not be able to just say, oh, I'm going to take some time off of work because there's this, extreme event happening. Might be needed even more then. So that is something to keep in mind for the disparity. So there's less access to healthcare for the, unfortunately, the same populations that often have the greater exposures to these climate change, heat and air pollution. And there's a lot of studies out there to show that some populations actually end up using the emergency rooms for primary care. And I think the last point is probably the most important. So even with the same access to healthcare, there's been evidence to show that there might be differential treatment just by the color of someone's skin, or maybe they have an accent. I've seen this also in my own life. So that is, unfortunately, a huge reason why, maybe people they share their stories and nobody believes them. I've heard other people say that nobody looked like me in the room. People didn't think I was smart enough to make decisions about my own body, or that I didn't know what these symptoms could mean. So these types of things are what I mean by differential treatment. Those are just examples. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing on time. Am I okay still, or? Okay, thank you.
Should probably transition to questions relatively shortly, but
okay,
yeah,
just let me know, because
yeah,
I won't go into a lot of detail because I think I have a few more slides. So I was going to just talk about the temperature and mental health study that I mentioned earlier. So there's also a difference here by race ethnicity. You could see that the y-axis here, it's kind of hard to see percent change in risk. The x-axis I redid here because I realize it's also small, but it's important to look at this. So psychosis, and that includes things like schizophrenia, or having a, different perspective on reality. Neurotic behavior includes things such as depression, anxiety, mood disorders, suicides, and homicides. And then the black lines are, I didn't talk about this earlier, but they're confidence intervals, but the estimates are the circles. The black is white, the red is black populations, blue is Hispanic, and then green is Asian. So there are not enough Asians for psychosis and neurotic outcomes, so that's why they're missing from the first two. And that comes to some cultural beliefs. I know that sometimes it's not okay to have mental illness. I as I said earlier, I come from India, and a lot of times people don't believe in mental health, or it's less accepted to get treatment for mental health versus, oh, I have a heart disease, for example. So that could be part of the reason that we don't see those numbers here. But what you can see here is that the Hispanic population generally has increased risk for all of these outcomes except for psychosis. Moving on to age group for the same outcomes. I have this key here that 6 to 18 years is black lines, and then the 19 to 64 is red, and the 65 and over group is in blue. And we didn't have enough 6 to 18-year-olds or children for the psychosis outcomes. But really what was kind of alarming, I wanted to share this, is that the 6 to 18-year group has some of the highest risk, maybe slightly greater than adults, but for suicides. For homicides, it is actually adults, but also for the neurotic outcomes, like I said, depression, anxiety. So I think, this is something that we often miss, whether it's by race, ethnic group, or by age. So climate change is multifactorial, heat, drought, wildfire, and, ultimately it's migration and displacement, what we've already seen. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here because I think I'm running out of time, but wildfire and drought studies in California. We've done some work on wildfire and some work on drought. What we're seeing is for wildfires, we're seeing very high risks for respiratory, not surprisingly, diseases, including asthma, also some cardiovascular related disease. We really want to focus more on some of the adverse birth outcomes, children's health, and mental health. We haven't done that as much. We see that wildfire smoke can also increase vulnerability to COVID-19. For some of the risk factors that I talked about pretty early on, same high-risk populations, whether it's COVID or wildfire smoke or heat. And then drought, these studies have been done in the Western US just because we've experienced a lot of drought recently. And there have been some associations with mortality or deaths and cardiovascular or heart hospital admissions. Okay. This is just some of the ways that our studies have been used. Just the one thing that I want to highlight here is we don't want it to just be research for research. I really am trying to say that we want to use this to make changes, put some policies out there, whether it's, large scale statewide policies or community level policies. And here's some of the things we've done, from assembly bills to the scientific journals and things like that. And happy to report that actually there are some areas that have heat and health action plans, and they've been proven to be quite effective. After that European heat wave that I talked about a couple of times, they're put in some plans that have really reduced these deaths and illnesses following a heat wave in Europe. There's been some citywide in Canada, throughout the US. Usually this happens after a heat wave occurs and there's a huge, whether it's deaths, illnesses, emergency room visits, then something happens. And we do have some documents and plans in California. And there's some California counties also. Okay, so what can we do about heat exposure? You could see that there's some things that you could do now before we have an event, and then other things that you could do during. And probably some of these things are pretty intuitive, and some things you've probably already done. But I think what I wanted to just bring up here is talking about populations at risk and the types of health effects that can result so that you can prevent those things. I mean, I think these kinds of things you can find at a website like ready.gov/heat and get more information there. The US EPA also, I'm just going to go through these quickly, but I'll have these up here. Also has released some guidelines and different things that we could do as a community. I know that Piedmont, we have some, heat plans already. So, we're ahead of a lot of other areas. But here's some other things that we could do. And then I think this is just, I guess, research that we want to do in the future. Just generally, I think a lot of our work is, as epidemiologists, I've been doing some population-based, wide scale, statewide. Sometimes we look at regions or counties or smaller areas. But now we know who the populations are at risk. There's all these like fancy maps that other people have done in California. Well, I think it's time that we have to do something about that, especially for the high-risk communities. And so that's really all of these things that I'm saying about our future work, whether it's drought, wildfire, heat, all kind of, I think, focuses on that. And thank you so much for your attention. If you want to reach me, here's my work email. Really feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about this stuff, obviously. So if you have questions that you don't get a chance, for example, to answer, ask now, feel free to send me an email. And that's it.
Thank you so much. We do have questions. I will move away from the screen share slides. And so are there any studies that you're aware of that compare the heat impacts in countries that do have universal health care versus countries like the United States and India that do not?
That's a really good question. Yes, there are studies, for example, Canada is, that's the easiest example. And, they've been having some pretty intense heat waves there in the last few years, especially, temperatures that they've never, ever experienced before. And that's why, places like Montreal, Toronto, they put together these heat action plans, which have been really helpful. So I feel like just in that in itself, they're ahead of the game. And of course, having that universal healthcare, you don't have those types of disparities that we see in the US, but there's still an association. There are still, things happening that probably shouldn't happen. And so there's still more work to do there. But yes, I do think that they are more, I don't want to say a little bit more prepared, but that is only because of what has been going on there recently.
And I'm not sure exactly what this question is, but so I'm just going to read it. How does the infectious process relate to the heat-related deaths? And I think that was from your slide where you showed all the flow chart of the different effects that led eventually to death from the heat.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't study, I don't focus primarily on infectious diseases, but we have looked at things like heat and a colleague of mine, hand, foot, and mouth disease or valley fever, those types of things. I know in other parts of the country, people have done work on West Nile virus, Zika virus, and other types of infectious diseases. So we're just seeing that with climate changes, for the mosquito-borne diseases, for example, the mosquito population is also changing, and they're changing where they're usually live, and also because the season itself is changing, and they like hot and humid climates. And if it's a little bit longer of a season, then there's a larger mosquito population, and therefore the potential to have more infectious disease. So those are just some areas that we've explored, and others have explored already. But I think that's going to be a big, just because we're seeing such a huge shift, that's going to be a big research area in the future too.
How quickly does the human body acclimate to temperature increases? Like, is that something that if you move to a warmer climate, your body will acclimate to the climate within a year? Is it something that takes, decades, or is it something that is passed down from generation to generation, and certain people who historically have been in a colder climate are more readily adapted to the cold?
Yeah, that's another good question.
The flip side is the heat.
Yeah, I don't know if there's so much to support that, but I think what I've been seeing is that it really depends on the individuals and the location. So, in some areas, it might, if there's just a slight shift, like you're just going from one, county in California to a neighboring county, but it is a little bit hotter, that might not take as long to acclimate. But what if you're going from a really cold climate to a super hot climate? That would take a little bit longer, so it just really depends on the individual. I do think that genetics does play a role. We don't know how much that does, but just what your body is used to and what you can tolerate. And it all depends on an individual's thermoregulatory capacity. So like, how can they, control body temperature, their own personal body temperature? And are they at high risk? So if it's, somebody who's pregnant versus somebody who's, healthy or relatively healthy individual, or is it someone who's older, or is it an infant? Because if you're one of those high risk groups, then of course it'll take longer to acclimate than it would for others. There's so many factors.
Mhm. You talked a little bit about the effects of heat on children and how children can be one of the more susceptible populations. I know our schools in Piedmont, and I'm sure schools in many moderate climates don't have air conditioning, or most of them don't have air conditioning. Some of our newer buildings may. How important is having air conditioning on the effects of students who are spending all day in school during a heat wave? And does that need to be balanced with air quality, like the ventilation that's required for, say, something like COVID pandemic?
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good question. So we have done a study on air conditioning use and how much reduction there is in health effects. And it does, of course, reduce the health effects, but there's still some, I would say, if you're looking at something like respiratory effects, it might decrease by 50% because you're using the air conditioning, just as an example. But there's still an effect. And whenever people bring up air conditioning, I just want to say that we can't rely just on that. What we really need to do is decrease the emissions themselves. But while we're working on that plan, use renewable resources. So we're not, we've seen this already. When everybody puts their air conditioners on, we have blackouts. So we can't rely on that. And if you have, solar panels or other types of electricity that you could use, then maybe that would be, a more reliable solution. But the way that we have right now, the grid and the infrastructure is just not capable of handling that. If there was like a real heat wave, everybody who has one just turns their air conditioner on. I don't know. We know that that's not a viable solution.
And it also, you talked about this, but it ends up affecting the disadvantaged populations
more, right? Because
disproportionately.
people can't have it or don't have it, right?
Right. So there's research that links air pollution, especially from car exhaust, to Alzheimer's disease. How strong is that link? And are there other diseases that have links to fossil fuel use that you're aware of?
Yeah, so I didn't present any of the air pollution studies. That's like almost the other half of our research. So yes, there's air pollution related to mental health. We've done some studies for those outcomes that you saw, as well as a lot of others, including, I don't think our study actually had dementia, but it had other related diseases. So there is a link there between fine particulate matter and ozone, and some also with carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide. Those are the pollutants that we have specifically looked at. And I've seen that too with other air toxics. So there's definitely a link. As I said, I think that the more we study, the more we realize that, wow, this is really affecting all of us. All of us and our entire bodies. There's not, a single thing that there's been more information that we're getting from studies to show that air pollution penetrates the blood and brain barrier. So even if you have it in your system, it's actually going directly into your brain and into your bloodstream, and also, for pregnant people, into the fetuses, into the heart. It's in your entire system. It's almost like cigarette smoking, except that it's more, maybe lower levels of exposure, but it's more widely dispersed.
We have time for one, maybe two more questions. So you talked about some of the policies, like state level policies and even local policies. Are you aware of any current legislation on the public policy side that we as League members or Piedmont Connect members could advocate for to help mitigate heat effects in our communities?
Yeah, some that come to mind is there's federal legislation called Momnibus, and also state. I want to say that some of our studies have been really directly applied to that, and it really helps with first make that connection between heat and pregnancy, and then to take it a step further to say that there are some people who are more affected. And so that's what the legislation does, is to just really, focus on this, not just all pregnant women, but high-risk groups. And then there's 2 assembly bills that were just, you might have heard about these, 2238, AB 2238 in California. And that is going to look more at local communities and improve heat alerts. As I said, they're so kind of arbitrary by local health department or local area. So we're trying to work on that. And then there's another assembly bill specifically to look at pregnant women. And I think all of our research has directly informed this legislation, which is really nice to see. We don't want to just keep it in the research world. So yeah, those are just some examples.
That's excellent. Thank you. I know league members are tend to be policy wonks and are always interested in that kind of information. I do want to be mindful of the time. It is almost 5 o'clock. I really appreciate all of the thoughtful questions. I appreciate all of the information that you shared with us. And I'm very grateful to you, Dr. Rupa Basu of the California EPA, for taking time to be with us today and sharing your expertise. I also wanted to thank Hope Salzer and Jennifer Trainer from the League of Women Voters of Piedmont, and Connie Herrick, who's with Piedmont Connect, for putting this program and the entire climate series together. As a reminder, our next climate series event will be on March 1st, and it's on electric vehicles policy and regulation. And recordings of past events, including this one, are available on our YouTube channel. And it's under the live tab if you're having trouble finding them. We'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this event, and that will include a link to the recording. So please feel free to share that email with friends and family who were unable to join us live for whatever reason, and consider subscribing to our YouTube channel also for easy access to future events. And of course, again, if you haven't joined the League of Women Voters yet, please consider joining us. So this officially ends our program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.